In this video, we're going to assemble a David Hockney joiner. These are some pictures I took a couple years ago in Costa Rica of the Arosi Valley. It's really beautiful. They're coffee roasters, people who plant vanilla beans. They have to pollinate them one by one. It's incredible. Now these photographs I photographed more as a horizontal landscape for a panoramic picture. I wasn't really thinking about a joiner. I really should have photographed above and below and been closer to different things up close to some plants. I should have even shown my feet, shown some sky. But I want to show you the technique for assembling in Photoshop. So here in Photoshop, you need to set up a pretty big canvas. File New. You need a canvas that's about 30 inches wide, which is pretty big, and about 20 inches tall. So that's pretty big. This is going to give you a lot of space to work with. It's also going to become a really large file. But I'm going to show you a technique for making sure the file is not enormous, because it can get too hard to deal with if you make it too big. So let's look at some pictures. Here, if I open one into Photoshop, drag it into PS, break off the tab, and if I just drag in a single picture, this is out of a Nikon, it's going to be pretty big. This is a gigantic canvas, but already layer 1 here is huge. We need to shrink that down. Otherwise, your canvas is going to be too big and it's just not going to work out so well. If you only have a 1 or 2 photos, let me show you how to shrink them down one by one. And you can do this for all your pictures, but if you have a lot of pictures, it's going to take a bunch of time. This technique works, but I'll show you a shortcut as well. My recommendation is to cut it down by 50%. They're going to get a lot smaller, and then you'll be able to fit them into your canvas more easily. So here, this is going to work out. So one thing I'm going to do though is I'm going to shrink them all with something called an action. Actions are really helpful because it saves you a lot of mechanical wasted time, a lot of wasted labor. But it can go wrong. So what I'm going to do is duplicate my folder. So my folder is called, I have all my pictures here in the folder called Panorama 1. I'm going to duplicate this folder, right click or alternate click, duplicate. And this is helpful because in case I mess up, I've got a backup. So I'm going to call this Panorama 2. Great file name there. Alright, so I'm going to create an action. This is getting into a bit more of a sophisticated thing in Photoshop, but it's really not rocket science. So I'm going to just do it, I'm going to copy this one, duplicate this one. This is going to be my test for shrink. And I'm going to open this up in Photoshop, and I'm going to make Photoshop watch what I'm doing, and then it's going to play back my action. So I'm going to open up the Actions panel, Window Actions, and as you can see, I love actions. I have a bunch of different ones for different things that I do, and it just saves me a lot of manual labor. I have it on button mode. I'll just take it off button mode for a moment. And I'm going to make a new set of them, call this Media Art. So I have them organized in different ways so I can find them easily. Okay, this one's going to be called Shrink by 50%. This is for the joiner. Doesn't really matter what you call it as long as you remember what it is called. Now already it's recording, so it's watching what I'm doing. I'm going to go Image, Image Size, Image Size, and under Image Size I'm going to change the width, and I'm going to cut it down by 50%. Now this works if all of your pictures are portrait orientation, because it's going to cut the width down by 50%. If some of your pictures are landscape and some are portrait orientation, you'll have to break them up first and treat them separately. Otherwise, weird things will happen, and some will be a lot smaller. All of mine are portrait orientation though, so that's fine. Some of yours might be landscape orientation and portrait, just separate them. But that's it. So I've clicked on Shrink by 50%. Now I want to go and save it. And notice how it recorded that detail. That's what I've done so far. I've shrunk it by 50%. I've saved it. But I'm also going to close it so it gets out of my screen. And now I'm going to stop recording my action. So this is an action I can play back now in Photoshop. So let's test it out. So this time I'm going to open up a file in Photoshop. And simply I'm going to click on my Shrink by 50% joiner action, hit the play button, and play it. And it's done. It happened instantly. Let's check out just to show you. So the pictures before the shrinkage, they're 2,000 pixels wide, but one that's been shrinking should be 1,000 pixels. Let's see if it actually worked properly. 1,000 pixels. So that's going to be a lot easier and you're going to fit more into your canvas, and that's a more appropriate size. So if you want to, you can go through manually through all of your pictures. If you have 50 pictures, you open up each one by one, hit play, it's good. And that wouldn't be bad, but you can do better. You can automate the whole thing. File, automate, batch. So instead, you do one click and all 50 pictures happen in a matter of seconds. So make sure you're choosing the right set of actions. I recommend making a new one for yourself, perhaps with your name on it. I only have one action in there, it's good to go. Now I need to choose where I want this work to happen with. Remember, I have a duplicate of my files. In case I mess up, I can always go back. So those have already been dealt with. I can just move those to my desktop temporarily. But the rest need to be dealt with. So I'll open up Panorama 2, and I'll just tell it where to choose. It's going to be Panorama 2. There we go. Choose. And then in 1 or 2 seconds, all of them are going to happen. So you're saving a ton of time at shrinking them down. I really recommend you have to shrink them, but that you don't do it manually, because that's a waste of time. Alright, so now start dragging your pictures into your canvas. Now hopefully you have some kind of pattern here and you know how you photographed it. I'm going to start sort of in the middle just so you can see the valley and the village come together. Grab the next one. Now in the joiner technique, things don't necessarily need to be perfectly lined up. Like, you might even want to rotate things a little bit. Remember when David Hockney was putting his work together, he was using glue and scissors. But do try to find things that overlap, like those buildings there. Those buildings actually line up, so I'll try to position them on top of each other. I'll just zoom in a little bit here on the village. It doesn't have to be really perfect. You can sort of mess it up a little bit, and that'll give it more visual texture as well. So those buildings, see those buildings lined up there in that detail there? So you kind of want them to line up to a fair extent, but maybe rotate a little bit, just give it a bit of visual texture. You have to press enter on the keyboard to commit the change. And fairly quickly, you can build your joiner. So again, this detail here, there's sort of a building there. There's a little bit of a lookout post looking over the Erosi Valley. And just depending on how you photographed your image, it'll take you a bit of time to assemble. Now, if you want to, you can also change the opacity as you're lining things up, if you want to get a fairly close lineup. But again, we're not really looking for a perfect lineup. We're looking for something that has sort of some visual texture. But fairly quickly, you can find out that this is coming together. Now, sometimes you might see a picture that looks like this. This is a Vector Smart object. If you want to go and edit the density of your picture after you already have it the right size, go and rasterize the layer. You might even want to adjust the exposure a little bit. Here on this file here, I have it selected. I'm going to do a levels command, Command L, and you might even want to just brighten and darken some pictures just to give them, again, more visual texture, to give it a bit of visual interest. I would actually recommend doing some adjustments like this, but again, you have to make sure you rasterize the layer. The other thing you want to do is you might want to rename layers. This is the right-hand side. Depending on what's in the picture, because they're all plants and trees, but I would strongly recommend, because you won't be able to know what layer is what. You can click them on and off to figure that out. Okay, so let's say I took some time to put in the pictures that I hadn't photographed, but if I had photographed pictures below, above, left, and right, you might have a gigantic canvas still. Again, you'll have about 50 pictures, upwards of 50 pictures in your joiner. You will need to crop it. Again, this one's not finished, but in the end, choose the crop tool, and then pick a good crop around it. Adjust your crop. Give a bit of white space around. And press enter. Now sometimes, here's some problems you're going to encounter. If you have not shrunk it down, first of all, you need to. But in case you haven't for some reason, or your file exceeds, I believe it's either 1 or 2 gigabytes, Photoshop will not be able to save itself. And in fact, I've even forgot to save my work, which is a bad part of this demo. You need to save your work. Photoshop will let you keep files that are either 1 or 2 gigabytes. But if you get them too big, you'll need to change the file format. But first of all, the correct file is always last name, first name, and then project, which is the joiner. So save that to the desktop. But if for some reason your file will not save, it could be because you've exceeded the maximum file size that Photoshop lets you save in. You can fix that by going to Large Document Format, PSB. I don't really know what that stands for. I'm guessing big, because it's really big. And you can also save in the Large Document Format. And this is important to work on your work between periods, because you might have a huge file. This one's not that big. It's only 72 megabytes, which is not that bad. But some of them will get into 1 or 2 gigabytes. They can be huge, especially if you don't shrink them down. But you do need to shrink them down. Ultimately, when you hand this in, choose, please flatten your work. Flatten image. We're going to discard all the layers. It's going to be a single merged layer at this point. And really, you only have to hand in a file that's as big as we're going to print. So we're printing on 8.5 by 11. So 8.5, actually 8.3 is fine. That'll shrink. This will totally be fine. If your file is around 20 to 30 megabytes, that's totally fine. That's not too big. Let's go and save as the hand-in version. And as always, the hand-in version is a JPEG. Same file structure, last name, first name, joiner, JPEG. It's under 30 megabytes. Save it. Actually, it's going to be 4 megabytes once we save it as a JPEG. And it gets compressed a little bit, the JPEG format. And that's it. That is how you assemble a joiner. Thanks for watching.